The colony ship Meridian had been drifting through dead space for 6 months when the Kralix warships found them. The aliens were massive, their scales shimmering like oil on water, their eyes burning with predatory intelligence. They'd boarded without warning, tearing through the hull with weapons that melted steel like butter. Captain Lisa Morgan tried to negotiate, but the Kralix had no interest in words. They rounded up the survivors in the main cargo bay, separating families with brutal efficiency. Among the captives was 8-year-old Danny Cooper, clutching his sister's hand so tightly his knuckles turned white. The Kralix commander stepped forward, its talons clicking against the metal floor. Through a translation device, its voice rumbled like grinding stone. The message was simple and horrifying. They would take one human as tribute to their sacred beast, the Draketh. If the humans complied, the rest would be enslaved but alive. If they resisted, everyone would die. The silence in the cargo bay was suffocating. Parents pulled their children closer. Some people wept. Others stared at the floor, unable to meet anyone's eyes. The Kralix commander pointed at random, its claw stopping on different people, watching them flinch. Then Danny stepped forward. His sister Katie screamed, reaching for him, but he pushed her hand away gently. He was small for his age, skinny and pale from months of rationed food, but his eyes were steady as he faced the towering alien. The Kralix commander tilted its head, surprised. It grabbed Danny by the back of his shirt, lifting him like a doll. The boy didn't struggle or cry. He just looked back at his sister and smiled, trying to be brave even though his whole body was shaking. They dragged him through the ship's corridors to a massive chamber that had been converted into something else entirely. The walls were scorched black and the air smelled of sulfur and burnt metal. In the center, chained but clearly deadly, was the Draketh. The creature was nothing like the dragons from old Earth stories. It was alien and wrong, with too many joints in its limbs and eyes that glowed from within its skull. Its scales were deep purple, and when it breathed, the air shimmered with heat. The beast was the size of a small shuttle, and every inch of it screamed predator. The Kralix threw Danny into the chamber and sealed the door. Through the reinforced glass, the crew of the Meridian watched in horror. Katie was screaming, pounding on the barrier. Captain Morgan's face was pale, her hands clenched into fists. Danny landed hard, scraping his hands on the rough floor. He pushed himself up slowly, looking at the massive creature that now focused entirely on him. The Draketh's chains rattled as it moved closer, its hot breath washing over the small boy. Its jaws opened, revealing rows of teeth like broken glass. Everyone watching knew what would come next. This was how the Kralix fed their sacred beast. This was how they proved their dominance over conquered species. The small human child would be torn apart, and his people would learn their place in the galaxy. But Danny didn't run. He stood up on shaky legs and did something no one expected. He raised his hand and placed it against the Draketh's scaled snout, looking directly into those glowing eyes without fear. The dragon went completely still. The Kralix commander pressed closer to the glass, its expression shifting from satisfaction to confusion. The Draketh was supposed to kill immediately. That was its nature, its purpose. For 3 generations it had served as executioner and symbol of Kralix power. Instead, the massive creature lowered its head, bringing its face level with Danny's. The boy's hand remained steady against its scales. Then, impossibly, the Draketh began to purr. The sound was deep and resonating, vibrating through the entire chamber. It pressed its head more firmly against Danny's palm, like a cat seeking affection. The silence in the observation area was absolute. Every human stood frozen, unable to process what they were seeing. Katie had stopped screaming, her hands still pressed against the glass, tears streaming down her face. Danny smiled, really smiled this time, and wrapped his small arms around the dragon's massive head. The Draketh's chains rattled as it moved closer still, curling its body protectively around the child. When the Kralix tried to enter the chamber to separate them, the dragon's demeanor changed instantly. It roared, a sound that shook the walls and sent the aliens scrambling backwards. Fire erupted from its mouth, melting the door controls and sealing the chamber. The Kralix commander barked orders, but the Draketh wouldn't release the boy. Hours passed. The aliens tried cutting through the walls, tried gas, tried sonic weapons. Nothing worked. The dragon shielded Danny from every attempt, its scales deflecting weapons that could crack starship hulls. Finally, exhausted and desperate, the Kralix commander activated the translation device again. It demanded to know what the human child had done, what trick or technology had corrupted their sacred beast. Danny, sitting comfortable between the dragon's massive claws, simply shrugged. He told them he hadn't done anything special. He was just kind to something that had probably never been treated kindly before. The Kraliks didn't understand. Kindness wasn't a concept that translated well to their language. They saw the universe through power and domination. The strong took what they wanted, and the weak existed to serve. A creature as powerful as the Draketh served them only because they had captured it young and broken its spirit through starvation and pain. But Danny had offered something different. In that moment when he faced death, he chose compassion over fear. He saw the chains, the scars, the dim light in the dragon's eyes, and recognized suffering. So he offered comfort instead of cowering. And the Draketh, tasting genuine care for the first time in its long, brutal life, responded with loyalty that ran deeper than any conditioning. The standoff continued through the night cycle. The Kraliks grew increasingly agitated. Their sacred beast had been the cornerstone of their military reputation. Other species feared the Kraliks not just for their weapons or numbers, but because they commanded creatures of impossible power. Without that symbol, their entire hierarchy was threatened. Captain Morgan saw the opportunity. She approached the commander carefully, her hands visible and empty. She proposed a trade through the translation device. The Kraliks could keep their reputation intact, could even claim victory, but they needed to let the Meridian's crew go free. In exchange, they could tell other species that their beast had accepted humanity as allies rather than prey. That would make the Kraliks seem even more powerful, commanders of creatures so mighty they chose their own companions. The alien commander's eyes narrowed, calculating. Pride was a universal concept, and the captain's words offered a way to save face. After a long, tense silence, the Kraliks leader gave a sharp nod. The chamber door was opened slowly. Danny emerged, walking beside the massive Draketh. The dragon's chains had been melted away, leaving only scorched metal fragments scattered on the floor. It moved with Danny, its huge form graceful and deliberate, never more than a step away from the small boy. The Kraliks' crew parted before them, their weapons lowered but their expressions wary. The Draketh's eyes swept across them, and several aliens took involuntary steps backward. They had seen this creature in captivity, thought they understood its limits. Now, unbound and protective, it was terrifying in ways they hadn't anticipated. Katie ran forward and grabbed her brother, pulling him into a fierce hug. The dragon watched carefully but didn't interfere, seeming to understand that this human meant Danny no harm. When other crew members approached slowly, offering thanks and amazement, the Draketh allowed it, though it never let Danny out of its sight. The negotiations that followed were tense but productive. The Kraliks agreed to release the Meridian and its crew. They would provide supplies and repair materials, enough to reach the nearest neutral station. In exchange, Captain Morgan agreed to say nothing of what had truly happened here. The official story would be that humanity and the Kraliks had reached a mutual understanding, facilitated by the wisdom of the sacred beast. But there was one condition the Kraliks hadn't anticipated. Danny refused to leave without the dragon. The boy, who had been so quiet and compliant before, suddenly became stubborn. He wrapped his arms around the Draketh's leg and wouldn't let go. He told them in a clear, steady voice that the dragon had been a prisoner long enough. If they tried to separate them, the beast would fight, and everyone knew what that meant now. The Kraliks commander's face went through several complex expressions: rage, frustration, calculation, and finally resignation. The Draketh was useless to them now anyway, bonded to a human child in ways their scientists couldn't explain or replicate. And if they forced the issue, the creature might kill dozens of their warriors before it could be restrained, if it could be restrained at all. So they agreed. The Draketh would go with the humans. They loaded additional supplies onto the Meridian, partly out of their agreement and partly because they wanted this situation resolved as quickly as possible. The dragon was guided onto the colony ship through the cargo bay, where it had to fold its wings and lower its head to fit. It settled into the largest open space available, curling its body to make itself as compact as possible, with Danny sitting against its side. The Kraliks departed without ceremony. Their ships vanished into the black, leaving the Meridian alone once more. But this time, the human crew had hope, and, unexpectedly, a powerful guardian. Over the following weeks, as the ship limped toward civilization, Danny spent most of his time with the dragon. He brought it food, talked to it constantly, and slept curled against its warm scales. The creature, which the crew started calling Ember for the glow in its eyes, proved to be remarkably intelligent. It learned to understand basic commands and showed surprising gentleness around the humans, especially the children. Katie was initially terrified of Ember, but she watched her brother's fearless interaction with the beast and slowly overcame her fear. Soon she was sitting beside Danny, running her hands along the dragon's scales, marveling at how something so dangerous could be so gentle. Captain Morgan, meanwhile, was dealing with the practical implications of having a dragon aboard. The creature needed substantial amounts of food, though it proved capable of eating almost anything organic. It generated tremendous heat, which actually helped with the ship's failing climate systems. And most importantly, its presence gave the crew something to hope for, a reminder that they had survived the impossible. But Morgan knew they were heading into complicated territory. When they reached neutral space, they would have to explain Ember's presence. Dragons, or creatures like them, were known to exist on a few worlds, but they were always firmly under alien control. A human crew arriving with one would raise questions, concerns, and potentially threats. She called a meeting with her senior staff. They gathered in the small conference room while Danny stayed with Ember in the cargo bay. The discussion was heated. Some wanted to release the dragon before they reached the station, avoid the complications entirely. Others argued that Ember was now part of their crew, had protected them, and deserved their protection in return. Lieutenant Chris Palmer, the ship's engineer, pointed out something everyone had been thinking but not saying. Ember wasn't just a dragon, it was a weapon. A living, loyal weapon that responded to a human child. If word got out, every faction in the galaxy would want to study them, separate them, figure out how to replicate the bond. Danny and Ember would never know peace. The captain made her decision. They would approach the station carefully, with Ember hidden as much as possible. They would claim engine trouble, request repairs and supplies, and leave quickly. The dragon would remain in the cargo bay, out of sight from station scanners. It was risky, but it gave them the best chance of keeping Danny and Ember together. 3 days from the station, their plan fell apart. A distress signal pinged across their communications array. A small transport was under attack by pirates, its engines failing, its crew dying. The signal was automated, desperate, and fading fast. Captain Morgan stared at the readout. They were low on fuel, their weapons mostly depleted, their ship barely functional. Engaging pirates would be suicide. But the faces of her crew told her they were thinking the same thing. They had been victims once, helpless and desperate. Could they really ignore someone else in the same situation? Danny appeared in the doorway, Ember's massive head visible behind him in the corridor. The boy looked at the captain with those steady eyes. He told her he knew what she was thinking. He said Ember wanted to help. The dragon understood distress signals, even if it couldn't speak them. Morgan looked between the child, the dragon, and her crew. Every regulation, every procedure, every bit of military training said to ignore the signal and preserve their own lives. But that wasn't the human way. Not really. Humans were survivors, yes, but they were also the species that ran toward danger to help others. It was stupid and reckless, and probably what made them special. She gave the order. The Meridian changed course, accelerating toward the distress signal with whatever power remained in its damaged engines. As they approached, they could see the transport spinning slowly, atmosphere venting from multiple breaches. 3 pirate fighters circled it like sharks, firing sporadically, keeping the crew pinned down while they prepared to board. The pirates noticed the Meridian immediately. They broke off their attack on the transport and oriented toward the new arrival. Their communications came through aggressive and mocking. They demanded cargo and surrender, probably expecting easy prey from a damaged colony ship. Captain Morgan opened the cargo bay doors. Ember, with Danny secure on its back and tethered with improvised harnesses, launched into space. The dragon's scales shimmered in the starlight, its wings spreading wide even though they were useless in vacuum. But the Dracith didn't need wings here. It expelled superheated plasma from vents along its body, propelling itself forward with terrifying speed. The pirates didn't understand what they were seeing at first. Their sensors registered the mass and heat signature, but their brains couldn't process it. By the time they began evasive maneuvers, Ember was among them. The dragon's claws, designed to rend flesh, tore through fighter hulls like foil. Its plasma breath melted weapons arrays and engines. In less than 2 minutes, all 3 pirate ships were disabled, spinning helplessly or fleeing into deep space. Ember circled back to the Meridian, its movements graceful despite the void. Danny was grinning, his face visible through his emergency helmet, completely unafraid. Katie was watching from the observation deck, her expression a mixture of terror and pride. The rescue crews from the transport were staring in shock as the Meridian pulled alongside. Captain Morgan hailed them, explaining they had responded to the distress call. She mentioned nothing about the dragon, though she knew every sensor on that transport had recorded Ember's attack. The transport captain, a woman named Linda Hayes, was grateful but confused. She kept asking what kind of weapons system the Meridian possessed. Morgan deflected, saying they had picked up some interesting technology along the way. Hayes didn't push, too relieved at being alive to question their rescuers too closely. They offered to escort the transport to the station, strength in numbers. Hayes agreed quickly. As both ships set course, Danny brought Ember back inside. The dragon settled into its spot in the cargo bay, steam rising from its scales as it cooled down. The boy fed it extra rations, praising it quietly, and Ember rumbled contentedly. News of the rescue spread quickly through both ships. The transport crew knew something unusual had saved them, and rumors filled the gaps in official explanations. By the time they reached the station 3 days later, half the galaxy seemed to know that a human colony ship had fought off pirates with some kind of unprecedented weapon. The station authorities were waiting. They demanded to inspect the Meridian, citing security concerns. Captain Morgan knew they couldn't hide Ember any longer. She made the decision to reveal the dragon, but on her terms. She arranged for the meeting to take place in the cargo bay, with Danny present and the entire crew standing witness. When the station inspectors arrived, their reactions were predictable. Shock, fear, fascination. They pulled weapons immediately, but Ember didn't move aggressively. It simply watched them, its eyes glowing, its body positioned protectively around Danny. The boy stood calmly, his hand resting on the dragon's scales, and explained how they had met. The lead inspector, a Vaxel named Greeks, demanded to know how the humans had managed to control a Drakith. Morgan corrected him immediately. They didn't control Ember. The dragon was free to leave whenever it chose. It stayed because it wanted to, because Danny had shown it kindness when no one else had. Grix didn't believe her. No one did at first. So Danny demonstrated. He told Ember to move to the other side of the bay. The dragon complied. He told it to return. It did. Then he told it to make its own choice, to do whatever it wanted. Ember considered for a moment, then lowered its head and gently bumped Danny, nearly knocking the boy over. The message was clear. The dragon chose the boy. The political implications were enormous. If humans could bond with creatures of such power through compassion rather than force, it changed everything. The Kralix would be furious. Other species that relied on domination and fear would see it as a threat to their power structures, but it also offered hope, a different way of relating to the dangerous and powerful beings scattered across the galaxy. Station authorities quarantined the Meridian for 3 days while they decided what to do. During that time, representatives from a dozen species arrived, wanting to see the dragon, study the phenomenon, make offers for Danny and Ember. The boy refused every proposal politely. Ember's responses were less polite, with warning growls and small displays of fire that made the visitors retreat quickly. Captain Morgan spent those days in tense negotiations. She pointed out repeatedly that Danny and Ember hadn't broken any laws. The dragon wasn't stolen property, having been freed by its captors. The boy was a minor under his sister's guardianship, and Katie had made it clear that wherever Danny went, she went. If the station tried to separate them by force, the consequences would be catastrophic. On the third day, an unexpected ally arrived. The transport captain, Linda Hayes, had stayed at the station specifically to testify on the Meridian's behalf. She brought her entire crew, all of whom owed their lives to the quick action of Morgan and her people. Their testimony, combined with the lack of any legal standing to detain the ship, finally convinced the authorities to let them go. But there were conditions. The Meridian would be tracked. Any aggression from Ember would result in immediate military response, and Danny would need to register as a guardian of a dangerous creature, subjecting him to periodic evaluations and restrictions on where he could travel. They agreed to the terms, knowing they had little choice. The station provided the supplies and repairs they desperately needed, though the costs were steep. Several crew members chose to leave, uncomfortable with the attention and danger that now followed the ship, but most stayed, loyal to their captain and fascinated by the bond between boy and dragon. When the Meridian finally departed the station 2 weeks later, it did so under the watchful eyes of security ships and news drones. The story had spread across communication networks. A human child and an alien dragon, bonded through compassion. Some called it a miracle. Others called it a threat. Danny just called Ember his friend. Their destination was a frontier colony called New Plymouth, far from major space lanes and political centers. Captain Morgan hoped they could find peace there, at least for a while. The colony was desperate for help, its population small and its defenses minimal. A ship with experienced crew and unexpectedly a dragon would be welcomed. The journey took 6 weeks. During that time, Danny continued working with Ember, teaching it more commands and learning to understand its body language and sounds. Katie joined the training sessions, becoming almost as comfortable with the dragon as her brother. Other crew members, especially the children, began interacting with Ember under careful supervision. The dragon proved patient and gentle, seeming to understand the difference between threats and friends. Lieutenant Palmer spent hours studying Ember's biology, fascinated by how it could survive in vacuum and generate plasma internally. He theorized that the creature had multiple redundant organ systems and could metabolize almost any form of matter for energy, It was, in essence, a biological engine of incredible efficiency and power. But Palmer also noticed something concerning. Ember was growing, not quickly, but measurably. The space in the cargo bay that had been adequate now seemed cramped. If this continued, they would need to find a more permanent solution. A dragon couldn't live on a ship forever. They arrived at New Plymouth to cautious optimism. The colony administrator, a practical woman named Helen Foster, was more interested in what the crew could offer than in judging them for their unusual companion. She listened to their story, inspected their credentials, and offered them land and resources to establish a permanent settlement. The catch was the location. New Plymouth was situated on a planet with hostile wildlife and unpredictable weather. Previous settlements had failed due to attacks from native predators and seismic instability. The colonists needed skilled defenders and workers willing to take risks. The Meridian crew, hardened by their experiences, fit the criteria perfectly. More importantly, Helen saw the potential in Ember. A creature that could fight off pirates and survive in space could certainly handle local predators. If the dragon could be relied upon, it might be the key to securing the colony's future. Danny liked Helen immediately. She didn't treat him like a curiosity or a threat. She asked him direct questions about what Ember could and couldn't do, what the dragon needed to be healthy, and what risks were involved. When he answered honestly, she nodded and adjusted her plans accordingly. They found a location for Ember 20 kilometers from the main colony, in a valley with natural caves and abundant wildlife. The dragon could hunt freely there, have space to grow, and still be close enough to help if the colony needed protection. Danny and Katie would live in a small house nearby, with Captain Morgan and several crew members establishing homes in the area as well. The first months were challenging. They built structures, planted crops, and established supply lines. Ember adapted quickly, hunting the large herbivores that roamed the grasslands and occasionally helping with construction by using its strength to move heavy materials. The dragon seemed to enjoy having space and purpose, and its bond with Danny only grew stronger. But peace never lasted long in frontier space. 6 months after they settled, long-range sensors picked up ships approaching the system. Not traders or explorers, military vessels, broadcasting Kralix identification codes. The message was simple and ominous. They were coming to reclaim their sacred beast. The treaty Danny's captain had negotiated was void. The Kralix High Command had decided that allowing humans to keep the Drakketh set a dangerous precedent. They would take Ember back by force if necessary and punish those who had interfered with their property. Captain Morgan called an emergency meeting. The colony had minimal defenses, certainly nothing that could stand against Kralix warships. They could try to hide Ember, but the aliens had tracking technology that could locate the dragon anywhere on the planet. Their only real option was to evacuate or surrender. Danny sat quietly during the discussion, listening to the adults argue about impossible choices. Finally, he spoke up. His voice was calm but firm. Ember wasn't property. The dragon had chosen freedom, had chosen him. If the Kralix wanted to take that away, they would have to go through both of them. Katie grabbed his hand, terrified but determined. She said she wasn't losing her brother again. If Danny was staying, she was staying. Several other crew members echoed the sentiment. They had come too far, survived too much to give up now. Helen Foster stood slowly, her face set with decision. She pointed out that New Plymouth was technically neutral territory, not subject to Kralix jurisdiction. If the colony formally claimed Danny and Ember as residents and requested aid from other neutral systems, it might buy them time. It was a legal trick, barely valid, but it was something. Morgan moved quickly. She sent messages to every contact she had, calling in favors and requesting support. Several neutral species, intrigued by the human dragon story, agreed to send observer ships. They wouldn't fight, but their presence might make the Kralix think twice about overt aggression. Meanwhile, Danny went to Ember. The dragon sensed his distress immediately, nuzzling him gently. The boy explained what was coming, that people wanted to take Ember away, that there might be fighting. He told the dragon it could leave, fly away to somewhere safe, start over without the danger that followed them. Ember's response was a low rumbling growl followed by a burst of flame that scorched the valley floor. The message was unmistakable. The dragon wasn't going anywhere. This was home. Danny was family, and anything that threatened that would face the full fury of a Drakketh unbound and unafraid. When the Kralix ships arrived 3 days later, they found a planet united and defiant. The colony had mobilized every able body. Defensive positions ringed the settlement. Observer ships from 4 neutral species floated at the edge of the system, recording everything. And in the valley, visible to orbital sensors, Ember waited alongside Danny, Katie, and a group of colonists who refused to abandon them. The Kralix commander contacted the surface directly, Its tone was different from before, less certain, more calculating. It offered negotiation instead of demands, clearly aware that the situation had become politically complex. A massacre of human colonists under neutral observation would be difficult to justify. Captain Morgan took the communication, with Helen Foster beside her. They'd proposed a challenge rooted in ancient Kralix tradition, a trial by combat. If their champion could defeat the colony's champion, the Kralix would leave and acknowledge Ember's freedom. If the Kralix won, they could take the dragon without further resistance. The alien commander was silent for a long moment. Then it agreed. Kralix honor demanded acceptance of such challenges, but it specified the terms. Their champion would be their finest warrior, enhanced and armed. The human champion would face it alone, with no weapons beyond what they could carry. And the battle would be to the death. Everyone knew what Morgan was suggesting Danny would have to fight. The boy was Ember's guardian, the one the dragon answered to. But he was also just a child, small and untrained. Sending him against a Kralix warrior was essentially murder. Danny stepped forward before anyone could protest. He accepted the challenge. But he added his own term. He wouldn't fight alone. Ember would fight with him, as they were meant to, as partners. If the Kralix wanted the dragon back, they would have to prove they were stronger than the bond between human and Drakith. The commander agreed, perhaps expecting that their warrior could still prevail. After all, one Kralix soldier was worth 10 of most other species, and while the Drakith was powerful, it had spent its life in captivity, beaten and controlled. Surely it wasn't as formidable as it appeared. They were catastrophically wrong. The battle took place on the open plains outside the colony. Thousands watched from safe distances, both in person and through transmitted feeds. The Kralix warrior was massive, nearly 3 meters tall, covered in armor that shimmered with energy fields. It carried weapons that could punch through ship hulls, and its movements were fluid and precise. Danny stood in simple clothes, unarmed except for a small knife at his belt. Ember crouched beside him, wings spread wide, eyes glowing with anticipation. The boy placed his hand on the dragon's neck, and they waited. The battle began with the Kralix warrior firing a plasma bolt directly at Danny. Ember moved faster than seemed possible, interposing its body and absorbing the blast with its scales. The dragon roared, a sound that echoed across the plains, and launched forward. What followed wasn't a fight. It was a demonstration. Ember moved with precision and fury, avoiding the warrior's attacks while targeting weak points in its armor. Danny didn't fight directly, but directed the dragon with subtle gestures and words, coordinating their movements. The bond between them was so complete that they functioned as a single entity, anticipating and responding to threats with perfect synchronization. The Kralix warrior was skilled and powerful, but it fought alone. Every strike it made was countered, every weapon ineffective. Ember's claws found gaps in the armor. Its fire overwhelmed the energy shields. And through it all, Danny stayed close, trusting the dragon to protect him, guiding their strategy with calm focus. In less than 10 minutes, it was over. The Kralix warrior lay defeated, alive but unable to continue. Ember stood over it, one massive claw pinning its chest, waiting for Danny's command. The boy approached slowly and looked down at the fallen warrior. He told it to return to its ship and tell its people what happened here. Strength wasn't just about power or domination. It was about trust, partnership, and choosing to protect rather than destroy. Ember released the warrior, who struggled to its feet and limped back toward the Kralix landing ship. The aliens departed without another word, their ships accelerating away from New Plymouth. The message was clear. The Drakith was beyond their reach now, bonded to a human in ways they couldn't break or replicate. The colonists erupted in celebration. Danny and Ember were lifted as heroes, symbols of human determination and the power of compassion over cruelty. News of the battle spread rapidly through communication networks, adding to the growing legend of the boy and his dragon. But Danny didn't feel like a hero. He felt tired and scared, aware of how close they had come to disaster. That night, sitting against Ember's warm side under unfamiliar stars, he talked quietly to Katie about what came next. They had won this battle, but there would be others. People feared what they didn't understand, and the bond between human and dragon was something unprecedented. Katie hugged him tightly. She told him that fear was natural, but they weren't alone anymore. They had the colony, the crew, and most importantly, they had each other and Ember. As long as they stayed together, they could face whatever came next. The dragon rumbled agreement, its body vibrating with the sound. It curled more tightly around the two children, wings spreading to shelter them from the cool night wind. Above, the stars wheeled slowly, indifferent to human struggles and victories. But here, on this frontier world, A new story was being written. A story of unlikely friendships, of courage in the face of impossible odds, and of the truth that sometimes the smallest act of kindness could change everything. In the months that followed, New Plymouth thrived. The victory over the Kralix had given the colony reputation and credibility. Other settlers arrived, drawn by the promise of protection and the chance to be part of something historic. Ember became a guardian not just for Danny, but for the entire community, patrolling the borders and driving off predators that threatened the farms and homes. Danny grew older, taller, more confident. But he never forgot the moment in that chamber when he chose compassion over fear. That choice had saved his life and given him a friend beyond measure. It had shown the galaxy that humans had something to offer beyond weapons and tactics, something fundamental to their nature. Years later, when asked how he had tamed a dragon, Danny always gave the same answer. He hadn't tamed anything. He had simply recognized suffering and offered friendship. Ember had done the rest, choosing freedom and loyalty over captivity and fear. It was a lesson the galaxy was still learning, one act of kindness at a time.